Hey guys, it's Coach Barrowline. We're going to continue our discussion about progressive presidencies today. We're talking about Taft, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, and how they, in some ways, continue the policies of Roosevelt, and also how they approach things a little bit differently. So President Roosevelt, during the 1904 election, had basically pledged not to run for a third term. Instead, what he did, he just supported William Howard Taft, one of his advisors and a friend who, even though was more cautious by nature than Roosevelt, did pledge loyalty to Roosevelt's program. And Roosevelt basically endorsed Taft, which was tantamount. Roosevelt was so popular, it was just like him handing the presidency to Taft. So Taft did work to secure Roosevelt's reforms. However, he didn't build upon them. He didn't really look to go past and extend what Roosevelt had done. He worked to secure several reforms. He created a labor department to enforce labor laws, and he also increased national forest reserves. He's also credited with the passage of the 16th Amendment, which granted Congress the power to levy taxes based on individual income. And this establishes the policy of the progressive tax system, which we still use today, where the more money you make, the higher percentage you pay in those taxes. And income tax was seen as a fairer way to raise money than through tariffs, which the poor had to pay a higher percentage of their income to pay for the higher prices as a result of tariffs. So the income tax was seen as fairer. However, despite this, he loses support of many progressive Republicans. First of all, he had tariff trouble. In April 1909, the Payne-Aldrich tariff passed, and even though it had started out as a low tariff bill, what happens is in the Senate, so many amendments had added on that it turns into a high tariff bill. Taft stubbornly, however, still signs the bill even though it's completely flipped to what it originally was intended to be. And many progressives were outraged because tariff reduction was one of the key components of progressivism, because they thought lowering tariffs would lower prices and make goods more affordable for the working class. He also had some trouble on the conservation front. In 1910, Secretary of Interior Richard Ballinger allowed business leaders to illegally buy acres of protected public land in Alaska. Gifford Pinchot, who was the head of the U.S. Forest Service at the time, found out and accused Ballinger publicly. This became known as the Pinchot-Ballinger affair. Taft, rather than supporting Pinchot, however, stood behind his Secretary of Interior and actually fired Gifford Pinchot. And lots of progressives thought that this showed that Taft was not committed to conservation. And it also is a turning point in which Roosevelt refuses to support Taft from that point and decides that in 1912 he's going to run for president again. So in the 1910 congressional elections, Roosevelt campaigned for the progressive Republicans who were opposed to Taft. So Roosevelt was actively campaigning for Republicans who opposed Taft. And this begins this split in the party that we're going to see in 1912. Roosevelt proposed a program called the New Nationalism. It's a set of laws to protect workers, ensure public health, and regulate business. It goes even a step further and is even more progressive than his square deal was. The reformers loved the New Nationalism, but his help created a split in the Republican Party, and therefore the Republicans lost control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 16 years. And by the presidential election of 1912, there was a severe rift in the Republican Party. So Taft and Roosevelt both run for the Republican Party nomination. Very rarely do you get two former presidents running for the nomination of the same party. But the Republicans stand behind Taft, and this outrages progressive Republicans who basically leave the party and, led by Roosevelt, form a new party called the Progressive or Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt was nominated as this candidate, so you have three candidates running for president. The third, Democrat Woodrow Wilson, easily takes the election because the Republican vote was split. He had 350 more electoral votes than Roosevelt and over 400 more than Taft. Although Roosevelt is seen as the most successful third-party candidate in American history. Now, Wilson was a reformer himself, although different in nature than Roosevelt and different in experience from Taft as well. Wilson was the former governor of New Jersey. He was a former governor of New Jersey. He was famous for fighting the corruption of political machines. He approved of direct primaries, which was a very popular progressive step. And he enacted a compensation program for injured workers, what we would call today workman's comp. Wilson proposed an ambitious reform plan that he called the New Freedom. And it focused on three main things. One, tariff reductions. Two, banking reforms. And three, stronger antitrust laws. All things that were in the progressive wheelhouse, but things that he focused on. His first priority was to lower tariffs. And he even actually went to a joint session of Congress and spoke to Congress to campaign for it. No president had done that since John Adams at the very beginning of the Republic, obviously. 1913, his support paid off and Congress passed the Underwood Tariff Act, which lowered tariffs to their lowest level in 50 years. Now, as we're lowering tariffs, politicians, leaders in Washington realized that we're going to have to find the money somewhere. So to make up for it, the act also introduced a graduated income tax, which is what I talked about earlier, the progressive income tax. People are taxed according to their income. So wealthy people pay a higher percentage than poor or the middle class. That's the way that the Underwood Tariff Act worked. His next target was the banking system, and bank failures were common at that time. Bank collapses were common. People would lose their entire life savings, and people didn't have a lot of faith in the banking system. So he established the Federal Reserve Act, which created a central fund from which banks could borrow money to prevent a collapse during financial panic. And it created a three-tier banking system. First, at the top, you had the Federal Reserve Board members that run the system. Then on that level, on the next level, you had 12 Federal Reserve banks that served other banks. So instead of banks for individuals, these were banks for banks. So banks would come to the Federal Reserve banks to borrow money. And third, on the last level, the bottom level, you had the private banks that people went to, and they could borrow from the Federal Reserve as they needed. And this puts the nation's banking system under supervision of the federal government for the first time, well, at least since the national bank had been killed during Andrew Jackson's administration. Next, Wilson turns his attention to antitrust laws. The Sherman antitrust law had been in effect since 1890 to try to limit the power of monopolies, but there were a lot of loopholes, and it still allowed a lot of unfair business practices to go on. So Wilson signs into law two solutions. One was the Clayton Antitrust Act, which was passed in 1914, and this clarified and extended the Sherman Antitrust Act, which it prohibited companies from buying stock in competing companies in order to form trusts or monopolies. It also supported workers by making strikes, boycotts, and peaceful picketing legal for the first time. So for the first time, you see the federal government saying workers have the right to agitate for their rights, for better pay, better working conditions, shorter hours, things of that nature. He also created the Federal Trade Commission, or had signed into law the creation of the Federal Trade Commission. This enforced antitrust laws, was tough on companies that used deceptive advertising. And the thing about the FTC is it could undertake special investigations of businesses and prosecute them for unfair trade practices. Wilson was also president when women finally gained the right to vote. The National American Women's Suffrage Association had favored a state-by-state approach to win the vote. However, younger women's suffragists were coming into their own and Two of those, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, broke from NASA and formed the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. This was basically a political party, a single-issue political party that lobbied Congress for a constitutional amendment to uh, to allow women to have the right to vote. And they took their cues from British suffrage tactics, like they picketed the White House, women went on hunger strikes, and things of that nature to try to bring more attention to the cause of suffrage. At the same time, several eastern states hold referendums on suffrage, and even though none of the motions passed, the new attention helped grow the size of the women's suffrage organization, specifically NALSA. Finally, NALSA joined the campaign for a constitutional amendment, and during World War I, the participation of women in the war effort in factories and doing different and newer types of jobs really helps weaken opposition to suffrage. So finally, in 1918, the 19th Amendment was proposed by Congress and finally passed by the states in 1920 with the support of President Wilson. So 1920, women finally gained the right to vote. As is often the case, even though reforms benefit many aspects of society, people of color still do not get much relief from the progressive movement or from the progressive presidencies of Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. African American rights were still extremely limited, and most of the three presidents, for the most part, the three presidents we're talking about were pretty shaky when it came to civil rights. Roosevelt did invite Booker T. Washington to the White House, who became the first African American to be invited for official White House visit. He also did appoint an African American tariff collector in South Carolina. And but he came down on the other end. I'm sorry. He kind of came down on the other end during the Brownsville Institute. A group of black soldiers were accused of going on a shooting spree in Brownsville. They were wrongly accused, it turns out, but he discharged those soldiers from the Army as punishment for this event, even though it turns out that they were not guilty. Taft didn't really deal much with race issues at all. However, Woodrow Wilson grew up in the South, and he actually kind of takes a step backwards on race relations. During his presidency, he opposes federal anti-lynching laws, saying that it should be state issue. He also allows the cabinet to resegregate the federal government, which had been desegregated since Reconstruction. And he let Congress pass a law making it a felony for blacks and whites to marry in D.C., in Washington, D.C. So as you can see, you have a mixed bag. It's progressive movement is good by and large for working class and the middle class consumers. It's good for women generally. And although African Americans do make some gains, you see in many cases their rights are being rolled back during the period. So it can be a mixed bag. The progressive movement is really going to get its death blow, though, with the outbreak of World War I. After World War I begins, people kind of become more focused on the war effort and less focused on those types of issues at home. So as we come up on World War I, we're going to see the attention of the nation shift. But first, in the next video, we're going to talk about imperialism and how America is becoming more involved in worldwide affairs and trying to kind of build an empire. So we'll talk about that later. See you. Bye.